Good day, and thank you for being here for the final and part 4 of our series, Coping with Nationalism, Searching for the Soul of a Nation, Religion, History, and Politics. And today's part 4 with Father Tom Bonacci is on coping with racism and nationalism. As we have done, we're doing a land and labor acknowledgement. And as we acknowledge the lands on which we work, serve, and play, let us remember the first inhabitants of these lands. We acknowledge that Contra Costa County is also the ancestral homes of the Bay Miwok, Ohlone, and Takiyokuts people, with each group having their own relationship with the highest peak that the colonizers called Mount D. We acknowledge the wisdom held by these human ancestors in their relationship to this land, and we seek to learn from their long stewardship. This land was forcibly taken from indigenous peoples, and the violence that occurred then and continues now is a source of grief and shame. Acknowledging this past, we also want to work towards racial justice now and for the future in the way we as people of faith live on this land, which includes revisioning the way we humans see our place in the world, how we interact with each other, as well as other species. We seek to learn from the plants and other animals who currently inhabit this habitat, and those displaced or lost through violence and land mismanagement. Otters, beavers, grizzlies, antelope, chub, and kangaroo rat, thistle, grass, and tule. As people of faith and good conscience, justice means moving from exploitation to recognizing interdependence at all levels of being. We must also acknowledge that this country was built on the free, enslaved labor of Black people, and that labor was violently enforced for hundreds of years. Let's honor the legacy of the African diaspora and Black life, knowledge and skills stolen due to white supremacy. With this acknowledgement, let's recognize a duty to give honor through our work and continue to stand up for racial and social justice every day. Let us remember that our purpose as a council in organizing against the forces of all forms of supremacy and allying ourselves, body, mind, and soul, with the people of color-led organizations that will lead us all into the future we imagine for ourselves and generations to come. Let us welcome Father Tom Bonacci from the Interfaith Peace Project. We're so grateful that you've been teaching us so fully in this series and can't wait to hear tonight's and final episode.
Thank you, Will. It's good to be with you. My blessings to everybody who is listening. It is my blessing and privilege to be with you. Let's recap and summarize for a little bit. We've been concerned with nationalism, patriotism, and Christian nationalism. Briefly, nationalism is that attempt to set up structures and to believe that one nation, in this case, our nation in particular, is superior to everybody else for any number of reasons. Or it could be that all of the nations have priority and should be separated from one another, each to go their own way. What is interesting is that many times nationalism tends toward authoritarianism and dictatorship. Patriotism, on the other hand, is love of country. And oftentimes associated with love of country is the relationship, the constructive relationship that an individual nation, such as our own, has with the family of the nations of the world. There are many who envision that the future of life on earth will depend on the nations understand themselves as belonging to the family of humankind and all the creatures and elements of the earth. Christian nationalism, on the other hand, is a nationalistic idea that's based on a certain type of Christianity. We have to be very, very careful because when we say Christian nationalism, we're not necessarily speaking about the way every Christian person thinks, nor are we necessarily talking about the great denominations and communities that label themselves Christians. There are many, many Christians who would resist, oppose, and work against any kind of nationalistic tendencies. So Christian nationalism is a way of speaking about certain movements that are, especially in the United States today, that are causing us deep trouble in our civic, social, and political and economic life. By and large, the Christian nationalists would think in terms of Jesus giving us a certain sense of rights over and against other people. We've also pointed out to you that when we talk about nationalism and Christian nationalism, the people we might label such may not self-identify that way. Some people consciously would call themselves Christian nationalists. Others would be surprised by the label. In order to cope with nationalism, and Christian nationalism in particular, we have to understand that various people who become involved in this may be motivated by different factors, different elements that influence their lives. That's why it's important for us in dialoguing with individual people to understand where they're coming from. What is their story, what is their experience, and what is their perspective. In part 2, we looked at the Doctrine of Discovery, which is a heartbreaking development in the life of the Christian church. In the age of discovery, or what we call discovery, basically when European discoverers went out into the earth and discovered land. The implications of the word discover is nobody else ever found this before, nobody else is there. How can you discover something that's already been discovered by somebody else? What the Doctrine of Discovery did was to give a theological motivation for saying things like, the people who live in the land that you discover really don't own that land. They don't belong there if they're not Christian. If they repent and become Christian, you can tolerate them to a certain degree. But the Doctrine of Discovery literally not only gave permission, but even commanded that so-called people outside the Christian community be removed. They could be dislocated, removed to another place, or in many cases, the justification for genocide and enslavement. Here again, we have to be careful, because this is a church doctrine, so to speak, found in certain documents at a particular period of time, does not mean that at that time there was no opposition. Once again, it's tense. We know that there were people who opposed the Doctrine of Discovery, as well as there were people who supported the Doctrine of Discovery. But there's no doubt from a historical point of view that the Doctrine of Discovery did untold damage to the life, livelihood, and well-being of countless people. In our third series of reflections, we considered the 1619 Project and critical race theory. Our main concern was not so much the content of the 1619 Project or the content of critical race theory. What fascinates me is the reaction to it that we're seeing unfolding in our politics and even in the pulpits in the United States. There is strong reaction against the 1619 Project and critical race theory. Of course, there are many people who support it, many people who apologize for it, and many people who say things like, well, it's not really being taught, critical race theory. The reaction tells us how embedded racism is. The reaction tells us how strong nationalistic movements happen to be at the present time. What the 1619 Project calls into question is the history. How shall we self-understand ourselves? What is the in fact history from which we came? Not being open to history or thinking that we already have all of the history told leads to danger. Again, it endangers the livelihood and the well-being of very, very real people. If you imagine, for example, and this is oftentimes reflected in our historical teachings and ponderings, take indigenous people. Indigenous people were savages and barbarians. They were a danger to civilization. They had to be Christianized. And wasn't it wonderful for those missionaries to dedicate themselves to these poor indigenous people to save them from themselves? Imagine at one time they were barbarians. They lived off the land, had no sense of civilization. If that's your historical understanding, you have just demeaned very, very real people. You've devalued them. As a matter of fact, historically, they've been removed and eliminated. How we read history is critical to how we understand ourselves. The reaction to critical race theory is amazing. It suggests, depending on how this discipline is used, and more than suggests that we need to examine the interrelationship of culture, legality, customs, traditions, and the way we live in light of racist tendencies. Once again, if a community of people are dehumanized, the effect of that in our cultural and legal development can be substantial. Take the Doctrine of Discovery. Still influences Supreme Court decision over how land shall be possessed, how land shall be sold, how land shall be understood. Unless we can critically examine the effects that our legal system has on the life of real people, then the mayhem and the chaos that we have inherited within our society will continue. Putting all of this together, we may ask ourselves the question, in light of Christian nationalism, is it really possible that someone can sincerely believe that one nation and a certain group of people within that nation have a divine right over the well-being of other people? And unfortunately, more than a few would answer yes. They would claim they have a God-given responsibility and a God-given right to dominate those they consider to be lesser human beings. How shall we cope with this? How shall we respond to this? Well, let's first of all deepen the problem a little bit more. In looking at the responses to racism and Christian nationalism in particular, there are an avalanche of responses. Hardly a week goes by or a month goes by when another book or article is not published, giving us insights into racism and insights into nationalism. You and I might become completely overwhelmed by this. What approach should I take? What is the proper language? What is the actual history? I hear reasonable arguments, not on both sides, but many sides. In coping with nationalism and racism, I think it's important for us not to think in terms of this side and that side, but to see the issues involved as having several sides. Different people will have different solutions and different perspectives. But first of all, we have to admit that the problem exists. Regardless of who may be at fault, what the conditions may be, or the historical development, we can get nowhere if we do not admit that there's a problem. There's an in fact problem within the society. Racism must be admitted, as nationalism must be admitted, if you are going to cope with it constructively. If we look at the in fact history, we see that people of color, to use a term, had to be dehumanized, their dignity compromised, and their right to be their own person denied, in order for certain economic systems to work. That gave us the institution of slavery, and we now live with the legacy of slavery. Simply put, slaves were not considered worthless. Their humanity was compromised. Their freedom was compromised. Their dignity was denied. But they were of value. They were of commercial value. They were a source of cheap labor. Their worthwhileness was in direct proportion to their productivity. But as in any system, massive abuses can set in. And once you believe that a person that you own is your thing, your toy, your tool, you can just imagine the cruelty and inhumanity that follows. When the history is told as if slavery is simply a fact influencing economics, as one dear person put it this way, the institution of slavery was a white man's outreach to poor Black people. So the enslavement of people was looked at as a charitable organization, so that even if such people were to be set free, there's a mindset that thinks they're not completely human. They don't have full human dignity. They are intrinsically savage. Sadly, if we look at the history, there were biblical, theological, cultural, economic, and biological reasons were invented to sustain such an idea that one human being could own another. In other words, slavery has to be justified. And in the process of justifying slavery, race was invented. An example. White slaves could find their freedom if they participated in or captured Black slaves. But Black slaves could never be set free. I know no incident where a Black slave turned in a white slave. It was the other way around. This led then to what we might call the invention of Blackness and the invention of whiteness. Now, history is a story. It's a story that tells you how a particular people understand themselves. In much of the influence that was in my life historically, Blackness and brownness was seen as inferior, and it was oftentimes justified in various societies by scientific research or so-called scientific research, investigations, and understanding. Sometimes we actually teach our children, let's reach out to those poor people, implying that those who have been the victim of injustice must in themselves somehow or another be defective. From the Bible, we see people have used verses from the Bible and stories from the Bible to suggest that certain people were slaves as the result of God's will. Therefore, to resist the institution of slavery was to resist the word of God. It is frightening to review the religious justification for slavery, white superiority, and subsequent segregation. As a little boy growing up in Pennsylvania, I frequently heard people use the Bible, religion, and belief in God to maintain the systems that are obviously unjust, to say the least. Let's look at two aspects of this by going back into the history for a moment. Let's look at the Civil War. Oh, I'm sorry. Is it the Civil War, the war between the states, or the war of northern aggression? Why exactly did we fight that war? Depending on where you live, who you talk to, what your history is, you have been told very, very different stories. Was the South fighting for states' rights? Was it attempting to maintain a certain economic engine based on slavery? Was the North filled with jealousy and went into aggression against the southern states? How we tell that story, what language we use, tells us the history from which we come and indicates the problem we have in the particular period of time called now. Here again, we see the invention of blackness and the invention of whiteness. No longer can we simply talk about a human race, we talk about races of people. And that implies that one race is superior to another. This is heartbreaking in the history, especially in the United States. What's heartbreaking about it is we never resolved the issue. In the wake of the Civil War, or the war between the states, monuments to Southern rebellious generals and military people became the landscape throughout the nation, suggesting that somehow or another there was a legitimacy here, that there's something legitimate about one person dominating another. We can see how this has led to some of the issues we have today when we look at something like voter rights, for example, or where somebody can live, or what property that they can buy, and what investments can they make. In 1915, we had a major breakthrough with the development of a motion picture called The Birth of a Nation. As a matter of fact, it was shown in the Woodrow Wilson White House. What was the story of the birth of the nation? Well, it's a kind of complicated story. Let's look at some of the elements within it. It gives us a window, and it gives us a summary of what we now call embedded systemic racism. In that particular movie, you see the fusion of nationalism, Christianity, and racism. There's the vindication of the KKK, the Ku Klux Klan. There's the blessing and the vision of Jesus. There's the misuse of sacred scripture. There are white actors with black faces, and their faces are painted black in such a way that you know that. For underneath the choreography of that film was a sincere belief that black people could not be actors. You would have to hire white people to be actors. Black people could fill in the background of the movie. Blacks were portrayed as savage, dangerous, and sexually charged. Blackness then, and black people, was somewhat synonymous with evil, distrust, savage, sexual, and interestingly enough, would oftentimes become the object of entertainment. While white meant trustworthy, clean, controlled, gentle, and courageous. Anti-racism demands that we examine our history and become aware of the impact the war has on our present-day understanding of our nation. From this perspective, the Civil War has not ended. It has lived on in our legal institution, economic ways of thinking, our theologies, and even in our religious life. Think, for example, that in the wake of the Civil War, suggestions were made that freed slaves should go back to Africa where they came from. There's some kind of a slogan you still hear today. Why don't you go back where you came from? Equal but separate. Please go over there. It's not natural for us to be together. Laws were passed compromising the right to vote, own property, live in certain places. Think for a moment of the legacy, the sick legacy of lynching, mass incarceration. Here's where you see the true legacy of slavery. By way of conclusion, let me share with you several approaches by which we might cope with all of this that can be somewhat overwhelming. First of all, we must be aware of our history. We must be aware that awareness of history is an ongoing process. This requires that we read multiple points of view, and not simply points of view because they are points of view, but because they have credibility in the science. We have to associate ourselves with knowledgeable people. We even have to meet people who are involved in the issue too. We have to be aware of my particular church's involvement, the historical involvement that our churches have had in the institution of slavery, where they stood on the Civil War, and what policies they had since the founding of the country. That means going back into the colonial period, the discovery period, and honestly looking at our doctrine, our development, our teaching, and our catechesis. This is without prejudice to say there's something wrong with our traditions, or we need to throw Christianity out the window. But we can't repair anything. We can't reform anything if we don't know what it is that we're dealing with. What, in fact, is the history? Why have so many denominations today apologized if there was nothing to apologize for? If there was something to apologize for, what was the actual history, and how shall we understand it? 3, realize that there's tension in the study. There's tension in the documentation. Look at the founding documents. Let's use an example. All men are created equal. Today, we could say, well, it meant men, it didn't mean women, and it certainly didn't mean black men, and it didn't mean black people. That does not invalidate the doctrine or invalidate the document. What it means is that there was a kernel of truth and insight in the original document that now needs to be developed today in the direction of justice. Perhaps we need to rewrite our documents and say things like, all people are created equal, and to have explanatory paragraphs by which it's inclusive. Otherwise, we can hold up the document and say, this is the racist document. What shall then we work? We have to be careful that we don't simply live in resentment. An example of this would be if we were to study slaves themselves. We would find out that in the history of slavery, there were men and women who stood up for what is right, good, and true. Look at the civil rights movement. We need to familiarize ourselves with people who use this documentation constructively and positively. Number 4, this can be extremely controversial, and so I suggest it with great caution. Even the Bible has to be reconsidered. If we have verses in what we call our revelational documents that support the oppression and the harming of other people, that cannot stand. The word of God is not synonymous with a verse in a scripture. The scripture says that the word of God is in your mind, on your lips, and in your heart. In this situation, we would have to ask ourselves the question, what's really in your heart? Have you met the people you love to speak about? Have you listened to their understanding of their own history, which is our history? We have to break the habit that we can use biblical verses or anything else for that matter to harm people we don't know. 5, we must work diligently to understand, appreciate, celebrate the dignity of each and every person. I'm afraid that so much of our so-called racial divide tries to deal with the issues of racism by putting people in the categories. Black people think like this. Brown people think like that. White people think like something else. We have to be careful with those categories. People can identify with other people, but when push comes to shove, what we're dealing with is the dignity of each and every individual person. We cannot make people abstract to a category. Rather, we need to incarnate the category into very, very real people. 6, we must understand the destructive nature of racism and nationalism on all of us as a people. It's not simply that racism has afflicted and affected Black people, or that nationalism and nationalistic tendencies hurt indigenous people. It hurt all of us. We can no longer support any structures by which we are going to teach our children, either consciously or unconsciously, that certain people are inferior, secondary, objects to be used, the source of our fear. Number 7, we have to be not too quick to apologize and ask for forgiveness. I don't know about you, but sometimes when I do something wrong, I apologize very quickly and I want your forgiveness. The last thing I want to do is talk about it. The last thing I want to do is face the issue that led to the misbehavior. Someday there might be apology and forgiveness. But first of all, there has to be recognition of the injury, understanding of what happened. And I'm afraid that one of the things we might have to suffer is shock that such a thing could have happened. We might have to sit with the pain and not immediately go to solution because we're trying to absolve our pain. We need to understand what happened. We need to identify what happened. We need to take responsibility for what happened, even if we're not guilty, so that this may never, ever happen again. Finally, I would like to share this with you. It is fashionable to say, I cannot feel your pain. No one person can understand the pain of another. I'm not sure that statement is true, but that would be another talk and another reflection. This is what I know. I can feel my pain. When I see what breaks my heart, because I can begin to identify, I can imagine having a child and somebody taking that child away from me because I'm a slave or the wrong person. That's heartbreaking. While I may not be able to feel the pain of another, I can feel my pain, and we can share our pain with one another. We must not surrender the nation to nationalists who would make enemies out of everyone who does not submit to their ideologies. We must not surrender Christianity to those who would use belief in Jesus to negate the human bonds of all people, a human bond we have in common by virtue of our common humanity. We must reclaim the word nation with patriotism and love. We must reclaim the name Christian for liberation, freedom, and dignity. It's my prayer for you. I beg that it be your prayer for me. That if our hearts break in the pursuit of this work, that's because we have a higher moral sense. May we realize that in dealing with nationalism, Christian nationalism, and racism, we are not dealing with ideas. We're dealing with very, very real people, even in the present day and the present age. Be aware of my love and prayers.
Thanks so much, Father Tom. Do you have any advice for those of us who have completed the study with you for moving into the future that you think would be beneficial for us as people of faith and conscience?
I would say study, have a little library or some articles, put some books together, do some serious study. Don't go out and buy 25 books. Do some work on the reviews. See what touches your mind and heart, what resonates for information. I think it's important for us to take responsibility and not simply say, well, I didn't have anything to do with that. I'm not guilty. It's not a matter of guilt and blame. It's a matter of taking responsibility. We can see the effects of this in the society today. Two, in my faith community, what is in the faith community to which I belong, what was our actual history from the colonial period to now? In the age of discovery, where do we stand as a church community, and where do we stand now? Did my denomination make apologies and amends? Do I know that? Is it part of my language? And maybe even to challenge those in leadership, has this been integrated into our worship and into our prayer? so that the process of conciliation and understanding is ongoing.
So we're an interfaith community as well. So we have folks that have co-religionists from all over the world, including Hungary and Turkey, and some would say Brazil. Some would say that we're seeing nationalism in India, parts of Israel. What would you say to our friends in the interfaith world that have co-religionists that are struggling with nationalisms in their home countries or where their families live? How interrelated are these different forms of nationalism?
Well, in some of the study that I have done, it seems like many of these issues are global and they are interconnected. They're interconnected economically, they're interconnected in power structures. We certainly have to examine the impact of social media and the technology behind social media and its influence on radical and extremist movements in the world. I think we still think that that issue is somewhat superfluous, but we're seeing more and more the impact of social media and social communication in the global networks across the board. Some serious study has to be done with that. And not simply studies so that we have some information that's theoretical, but it would help us to understand how do we read the news? What are our news sources? What are our children looking at? Once again, are we dealing with the legends and the myths that people are making up in order to justify their prejudice and economic advantage? Or are we looking at the real history that's involved? And we have to understand how social media works and how, again, it can be used for economic advantage while it kills people, while it hurts people and endangers people. For the interfaith community, this, from my personal point of view, the interfaith community cannot look at this issue as secondary to the work it does. It would seem to me that those of us in the interfaith community who have been able to cross over the borders to some extent to meet the other as companion, that we need to be aware of what's happening in our locales and our common voice speak up. The interfaith community can speak across the world. It doesn't have to stay inside any particular nation or any particular grouping of people. It literally can become a conscience in the world.
And that's the hard part, because there are folks that want to protect the reputations of those countries that probably need the most work against authoritarianism that leads to this kind of nationalism.
Well, if that's the case, and again, I don't want to be hard, cruel, or mean, but that may be the difference. It depends on what you mean by interfaith work.
Yeah.
If interfaith work means let's come together and see what we have in common, and only stay within the confines of what's in common. Well, I sometimes think that what we're saying is let's get together and discover what's comfortable.
I would think that that's more multi-faith work rather than interfaith, because I think interfaith takes us deeper than just making peace between the American adherents of the different faith traditions. It's about understanding the differences and being willing to celebrate the differences as well as what we have in common.
And understanding that when you begin to cope with differences, which can lead to conflict, but it can also lead to delight. Think of how many times you heard somebody say, I never looked at it that way before, that's delightful. But the other
That's
thing
why I do
it
interfaith
gives,
work, is for those moments. It's for those moments.
Yes, that's
what
exactly
keeps
right.
me going.
But it also, upon reflection, when I look at those joyful moments, what I see is an infrastructure for doing the justice work. The interfaith community has the capacity to put a human face on these issues, to tell the stories of very, very real people. And oftentimes, the people who are in interfaith leadership have personal stories that deal with racism, nationalism, authoritarianism, and economic injustice. The interfaith community can also provide environments in which we can meet people we love to talk about. I know I say this over and over again, but I think it's really important. We need to meet people we love to talk about. Otherwise, we can talk about people nicely, but we leave them in categories. And then we get offended if they don't live up to the category.
Well, that's the other thing that interfaith encourages us to do, is not assume that we know other folks based on their categories. I like to say that if there are 2 billion Christians, there are 2 billion Christianities. And that if our Christianity isn't changing from year to year, then we're probably not practicing it correctly. We're not really growing.
I think that's very wise. There's a tension in this work. And for any of us who's ever been involved in interfaith work, there's a tension there. And that's why I want to say, inside our sacred scriptures, inside our revelational documents, inside our national documents, there's tension. There's some brilliant things that were said and some awful things that were said. And we don't have to collapse to either or. We can learn from this. We can purify the document. We can grow and develop.
Most of our scriptures are libraries written by multiple people. So we should come to expect diversity inside our scriptures as well as without.
Sure. So when I read a biblical text, it can easily be interpreted with a sense of hostility, go into the land and kill them. The question I want to ask myself is, did I ever have that kind of feeling? Can I identify with this? But to think then that this is an ethical imperative, perhaps the text was written in such an outrageous way that we won't do that. That it'll shock us to wake up.
Or there's someone in our tradition's history, like Augustine, that encourages us to read the Bible with a law of love, and to compare our interpretations to the law of love rather than division too. It doesn't mean we have to be unified on everything, but it means that we at least view our scriptures through the law of love, that it's meant to increase our love, compassion, kindness, and caring.
You know, wonderful scholars through the ages and saints have said that at the heart of every virtue is the virtue of love. Love is what informs the virtue. What I think is really needed is the virtue of justice. I don't want to use my love for you as a cover-up for not being just to you.
That's what's so hard in this interconnected world, is that so many of our economic activities do make victims out of somebody in the world.
Yes, you know, I look at something like the birth of a nation, and there you see Jesus blessing the KKK. And to think that was in the White House. to think that that's a movie that's been called the epic film of the beginning of the modern movie industry. That's a window on our soul. We have to ask ourselves the question, how did it ever become comfortable to use the person of Jesus to justify a nationalism that would kill and a racism that would condemn? You know, we could even use the word love and say, well, the Bible invites us to love those who are like us, those who are similar to you, those who agree with you. And anybody who dissents or thinks differently needs to be excommunicated, nullified, or killed. We're seeing that kind of language in the United States Congress.
Even between people of the same faith tradition who are trying to bar each other from sacraments for political reasons.
Yes, and I have to ask myself, is it for political reasons? Or is this the continuation of the war between the states? Is this the continuation? Is there racism behind this? Is there sexism behind this? I find it frightening what we're seeing emerging right now in the country, the suggestion that women are responsible for sexism, that women are responsible for men no longer being men, that it's time for men to become men and become the head of the family, whatever that's supposed to mean. And we're using Bible verses. We're using traditional religion. We're saying this is the way it used to be. This is what's normal. That has to be questioned. Liberals have to be, or progressives have to be very, very careful that they don't call this stuff conservative or orthodox. It's hate. It's unjust. And even if it goes back in history, it was unjust then.
Yeah. Thank you for blurring so many lines for us in this whole series, Father Tom. We really appreciate your spirit, your tenor, your pastoral heart for all people. And may we live into this interfaith present and future in ways that allow us to really reclaim what it means to be brothers, sisters, siblings of each other in one human family, despite our religious and cultural differences.
And thank you, Will. And one of the things that people could do is to follow your teachings and your wisdom. And thank you for all the people that you have lifted up for us to bless.
Thank you. Blessed be. Thank you.